So thank you. All right, well, that was a very generous introduction, and I don't know if I'm really going to be worthy of it, but what I will tell you is this. I have known Chris here for a little while now, and started making contact with him to be able to network in the market. And part of one of the big reasons is because he has a lot of expertise in data science, and we've definitely seen that becoming more and more of an emerging trend and something that we've seen popping up with more and more of our clients. I will give you a couple caveats. I am not a data scientist. I am not in the technical domain there. I was a mechanical engineer, and I've been working in the recruiting industry for 15 years, not 20 years. And so I can answer a lot of questions around, though, what are some of the things that go into some of those decision processes? What kind of trends have we been seeing? Because I do focus entirely on engineering and technical. And so some of those kind of things, basically, I'm also not a professional public speaker. So if you have little things that pop up or little questions or things you want to throw out there at any point during the conversation, just do it. And I know there's going to be a little bit of time for some conversation afterwards. So if you'd prefer to wait till then, that's fine as well. So just a little bit about our organization so you can know, what we're about and kind of where some of the information that we're gathering comes from. We're the #1 provider of engineers and technicians in the United States. We were actually founded in Maryland in '83. And part of some of our knowledge base, or where we have some of our data coming from, is we have a little over 100,000 people that work for us across the country. 19,000 different customers and 3,600 recruiters. And all of that is housed in a company that we're privately held. So all of that data gets shared across the organization. I know folks who do my same job in most of the other metropolitan areas across the country. And so there's a lot of sharing and collaboration that happens, especially in some of these areas where we're learning about how to do it, or what's important in these industries as well. That's our geographic footprint. Again, I mainly just showed this so that you can see that we're kind of spread across a lot of the different areas. So, data science. Again, not a data scientist, but what we do see in this area that I think is kind of particularly important, I focus mainly in engineering, right? And so in that industry, right, it's a lot of mechanical engineering, software engineering, it's hardware development centric. All the way through manufacturing and industrial engineering. And one thing we've seen as a recurring trend over and over again is we see more and more industries that have never hired a data scientist or never hired anybody who did anything in the data science domain come to us talking about getting their first person to help make sense of some of this mountain of data that they're starting to get, or being able, hey, how can we use some of the tools that are available out there to be able to do our jobs a lot more effectively, to be able to potentially change our processes for manufacturing or production around. So we've seen a ton of growth across a variety of different industries with that. Part of that has to do with some of the practices that are out there and some of the techniques that are used in AI and machine learning, and some of the ways that they're continuing to be refined, right? I mean, I think just in the conversation that we were having around here, we had folks that come from a whole lot of different types of backgrounds that still get involved in some segment of data science. And we also see that continuing to change and continuing to evolve. So, what we know now to be the role of data scientist might mean something, it definitely means something completely different in the automotive industry if we support it there. It definitely means something completely different in the engineering sector if it's a product development company. And it means something completely different in the financial world. So, I think that's one of the kind of interesting things about the skill set in the area that as we have conversations with folks who are in data science, right, you see some of those backgrounds where they have done a ton of different things. So this is, took a chance to just gather some data and information just more around the software skill set and the software hardware industry locally here. And this is kind of what we were able to pull from some of our internal and external sources. So just in the DC metro area and the Baltimore metro area, you have 957,000 jobs. And this is not open-end jobs. This is employed jobs. These are roles that are assigned in those industries. And that's covering everything across the board, but the #1 with a bullet, right, is in software development. That also covers a whole wide variety of employers. Like we talked about earlier, a lot of technology in this market, a lot of DoD integrators. We see a ton of different medical device companies that we work with, some automotive areas, but also just the widest variety of those from small startups and companies like Chris's, who are working in some of these these kind of shared spaces, to conglomerates that have over 1,000 technical employees in one site. And so, that's just a little bit about the opportunity there. And I also thought it was a pretty neat stat that we're also number 3 in growth, right behind old San Jose and San Fran. Now, not in total jobs, but in growth, right? And so, they market those kind of things because, hey, where are those opportunities coming from? As I talk to my peers who are across the country, one of the very unique things about the DC market is the total variety of the market that exists here. Right, you have a ton of the government work, you have a ton of the work in the private sector, and you have that almost like mini Silicon Valley kind of thing going on because of some of that intermingling. And that doesn't even include, the stuff that's going to happen there with Amazon's HQ too, right? Which will even, grow that even more past where it is right now. Any questions about any of that stuff? I don't want to fly through anything. It makes sense? Okay. So we also have some data that's available to us that we utilize effectively to be able to figure out what are going to be the hot button areas that we want to be able to invest time and energy in terms of being able to recruit and fulfill for some of those markets, right? And so we use a tool called supply and demand that utilizes a lot of external data sources, and it also utilizes our own internal data sources we have around compensation and everything else that falls into that. And so I ran one for data science skill sets around 50 miles of Bethesda here, just to get a sense for what some of that looks like. And this are the results. So 1,257 candidates, right? 35,300 jobs. So I know you probably haven't looked at too many of those, but that in what we've seen when we look at a lot of these different skill set areas is a very, very big delta. It basically means that the market there is a very, very difficult one to do any hiring in, right? I think we have this index called like a hiring indicator, and that puts it down into the teens, where I think a healthy one is up around 45 or 50. So obviously this is one of the biggest reasons why I think a lot of people are interested in this area, right? I think you were talking earlier about University of Maryland and so many schools pouring resources into that education piece is because they see this jobs gap, and they see that there's a huge need for what you guys are doing. Well, we also come across, and one thing that I thought I might be able to share with some of you all, right? I am not a data science expert, but I am a recruiting expert. And so I deal with literally hundreds of people every year as they're embarking on their job search or closing out their job search or working through processes with interviewing or how to prep for things or how to get started on your career, right? A whole variety of different things. And the data science realm is a particularly challenging one in that just from the skill set and the supply area. And that was the reason why I pulled that stat of 30% in 2018, and also the 12 to 15% growth is also to just accentuate how much that gap is, right? And a big part of what we try to focus on, especially in skill set areas like this, where we know there's a huge dearth of talent, right, is to really get into the networking piece and the referrals piece. So we have a lot of conversations with people. We try to network as much as humanly possible to be able to find out who folks know and be able to learn and meet people through those kind of areas. So another reason why these kind of meetups with Chris here, right, are another valuable tool for being able to expand your own search, right, if you're looking for something. This is how it kind of impacts what we try to do from a recruiting standpoint. We have a highly competitive market. Anything having to do with software development, data science, and the rest of those, we pretty much are dealing with folks, and I'm sure if you guys have gone out there and put yourself on the market, You probably have a scenario where you're receiving a lot of interest, right? In some cases, maybe an overwhelming amount of interest. And that really kind of plays out with us with typically having scenarios where people are looking at multiple job offers, dealing with a lot of counter offers, which I have my own opinions on either accepting or declining those, and also just entertaining a lot of different potential opportunities all at the same time. We have to do a ton of work with going out and finding folks who are coming from other markets and looking at people who are maybe not in one of the fastest 3 growing markets in the country, and hey, are there little things about living in the DC metro area that somebody in Boise, Idaho might love? Or is there something about that particular company? Is it a new growth segment? Is it in an area that is really doing something really, really neat from a cutting edge technology standpoint that can attract them to the area? But that has its own pitfalls, as anything else does, because then you're dealing with a lot of logistics issues and things like that a lot of times kind of manifest themselves. And we're also dealing with a supply versus demand disconnect. So, it's one of those kind of things where if you talk to most of the clients we work with and employers 4 to 5 years ago, they had a wholly different opinion of what the job market was like. A lot of times we are still dealing with people who have a lot of, they think they know exactly what's going on in the market. They either are entirely too particular about the little tiny details around what the perfect candidate needs to be able to bring to the table, or they have, they just want to run somebody through a gambit of an interview process that lasts 2 to 3 weeks, and those folks have 3 to 4 offers in that kind of time frame. So that's something that I think takes a little bit of time to be able to kind of educate people on, or either to have them do that or learn the hard way. But it's definitely something we see as an impact on our business. Is anybody here in the job market or looking for a change in roles? So a lot of folks. So this would be some of the stuff that I would advise to you, or just have you kind of keep in mind when you're going through the search, right? Like I said, I literally deal with hundreds of people every single year, and I see a lot of folks who approach it in a very, very tactful kind of fashion. They're very professional, they're very thorough in their process, and I see a lot of folks who are not, right? So this is my advice to you about how to differentiate yourself. Number one, be really intentional on the roles you want. Like, put some serious thought into that before you go out there into the market and just start to be able to shotgun your resume all over town, right? Know what you want to receive, know if there's a target industry, know if there's a target company. And you can actually differentiate yourself quite a bit by being really intentional about how you contact those folks, right? Not just throwing your resume down a hole, or and hoping that somebody can potentially respond to it, because a lot of times that can end up in a scenario where your resume doesn't get seen for weeks, right? But if you intentionally can find contacts who are there, and contact them on LinkedIn, or make contact with somebody who is in there directly with a phone call or a cover letter or something that's really pointed about that particular opportunity that you really want to go after, that's how we see a lot of people really step themselves up out of the crowd to show that just that level of interest. I know it's very, very old school, and we're living in a digital age, and we're all in the data science world here, but that is a huge differentiator that a lot of people don't necessarily take advantage of. I also would really, really recommend that you delve into details around the company, the folks that you're dealing with, the folks who are running those different divisions, and the programs and projects they get into. When I work with somebody who is not as familiar with that industry or that company or whatever, we go into a lot of those kind of details, right? Which might be great for that particular individual. But if you're just out there looking on your own, you might have a scenario where you go into a phone conversation, a phone interview, not knowing all those things. And sometimes that little piece there can maybe just be the missing part that doesn't get you to that next level, right? But having a lot of that research already kind of done and figured out, exploring the webpage, exploring the programs and projects, news articles, contract awards, and the rest of those kind of things is a really, really nice thing to have on in your court. And work on your resume details. So I hear from a lot of people that we're dealing with all the time, hey, I want to be able to add some details to my resume, but I don't want it to be more than one page. That's really an old wives' tale in terms of what I have seen in my experience. If you have a lot of technical experience, you should make sure that it reflects itself on the resume. Not to the tune where it's more than 5-6 pages and somebody gets really, really bored reading it from start to finish, right? But to the tune where each one of your experiences really does truly detail what you have been able to accomplish yourself in that role, in that area, and what kinds of technologies you utilized in that role, in that area. A lot of times we see resumes that might have a skills section that's 3/4 of a page long, and maybe somebody had dealt in that skill for a week, but they can't answer questions around it. I know a lot of employers that will ask people a ton of questions about everything that they see on their skill summary that they get in there, and if they don't have a lot of detailed knowledge about it, they're kind of out, right? Because then they don't trust anything else on the rest of the resume. So make sure it's something you know about, but make sure that it also finds its way into the meat of that resume so that you can know that you can be found through keyword searches and scanned when you're actually looking through. Another thing is areas on people's backgrounds that we would refer to as a red flag, right? Maybe it's not the best term, but if you're familiar with the concept of going out and proposing something, there's a concept of ghosting, right? Where if you're proposing something in a proposal, you want to be able to look at that with a very, very constructive set of eyes and say, okay, if I was deciding about this particular proposal, where are the areas that I think I would pick out that are weaknesses? And in the same kind of breadth, you should look at that in terms of how you're portraying yourself in your resume and your cover letter and the rest of those kind of things. To be able to know the things that people are going to potentially bring up as weaknesses and areas of concern. So maybe it's gaps. They're perfectly explainable. Maybe it's a tenure scenario in certain jobs. Maybe it's a number of different industries and jobs, whatever it is. Like everybody has their own thing that they know, and their own thing that probably could jump out there on a resume. And my advice would be just to take a really constructive look at that and be able to know how you would address that, and whether or not it's something you might even want to bring up in some of those conversations, or maybe even in a cover letter, to be able to explain where that came from, right? Because if it goes unsaid, what will probably happen is that people will assume something that may or may not be the right case. That's literally all I got. So but I did hope that we could maybe have some conversation around some of these things, because I know the topic is probably something that, especially if a lot of you folks are looking for work, there's probably things that have popped up, and I'm happy to to be an open book here to answer any that you got.
Hi, I'll ask you, since we also hear a lot of government jobs, what's going on with as far as data science in any cybersecurity firms? Have you seen more? Is that being used at all in security firms as far as doing data science?
Yeah, I mean, so I want to be really careful not to speak like holistically across entire industries, right? But I mean, there's what I would say that I've seen is an increase in the proliferation of data science across a variety of different programs and projects. And the government, like in many of its areas, is usually a little bit slower to pick up some of those pieces than some of the commercial segment, right? But then once they get it into their head and into their thought process and their acquisition process for major programs, that data science and cybersecurity are absolutely things that we need to have ingrained into each one of these platforms, then that's where you see that kind of head of steam where it starts to become something that's part of everything. So absolutely I do, and I think I've seen it locally, at least here with some of the healthcare stuff that goes on at NIH, right? There's quite a lot of stuff with that. But then we already had seen it for years in the clinical space, where NIH was already doing a lot of that anyway, right?
Thank you. So you mentioned that there's a huge gap between data science candidates in this area and data science opportunities. There are far more opportunities than there are candidates.
Right.
You also mentioned that that a lot of the institutions around here are investing heavily in programs to help develop new data scientists. do you see in the immediate future, 3 to 5 years, or even as far as 10 years, do you think that that gap is going to continue growing, or do you think that it's going to get a little bit healthier as more talent gets trained and gets onboard into the area?
Yeah, no, I mean, I do see. I mean, like I think I was actually looking at some of the data around what that looks like year over year, right? And it has been accelerating in terms of that gap year over year. Now, how many years that goes out like that? I know there's a lot of folks who are interested in making a move from different career paths into data science, right? And so how do you do that, and how do you make that happen, right? That's very, very much like not to derail too much, but that's very, very much a person by person specific kind of conversation. But a lot of it has to do with how can you connect up some of the tenets of data science and some of the core activities you're doing at your current job or at another job that you have had in the past to some of the activities that you would do in a data science world. And then how do you continue to grow and cultivate that skill set while you're at your current job to be able to groom yourself to where you would want to go. But yeah, I do absolutely see that continuing to be an issue. But it's also an issue in some of the other more core traditional STEM areas too, right? Like software developers, electrical and hardware engineering. A lot of those areas are also starved for talent, not quite to the extent of data science. Yeah.
Thank you. Do companies have a different approach while evaluating the candidates when they are looking for applications for summer internship as opposite to a full-time role?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, I think most of we don't actually do a lot of hiring for summer interns, but the companies we work with definitely have a different decision factor when it comes to some of those kind of things, right? It generally has to do with how applicable is that direct educational degree and background and some of the coursework apply into some of the internship activities that they've set aside for summer interns, because typically they know, hey, what do we want to be able to accomplish with our internship program.
Yeah, and given the lack of talent, you also mentioned that a number of companies have made a shift in how they look at hiring candidates just over the past 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any movement towards hiring teams of people instead of trying to find the perfect unicorn candidate if there's too much competition there?
So in my experience, companies hold on to try to find the perfect unicorn candidate until literally it's almost the last possible minute to not do that. So that's a very, very difficult thing to break into or to break out of. But I will say that the one thing that it has created a lot of opportunity for is for folks who have some consulting capability to be able to gap fill, right? Because when the true gap of that becomes so deep that you've had positions open for 6, 8, 9, 10, 12 months or something along those lines, then they say, well, we've got to get this work done in some kind of capacity. And so they just end up paying a premium to be able to consult. Yep.
I'm curious if you've seen, like, those 32,000 jobs, are those data scientists looking very similar to each other in these orientations? You had like 5 different types of jobs. Are you thinking more about, or if they're becoming more specialized, like a data engineer, visualization specialist, these sorts of things? Or are they still being seen as data scientists more broadly? And also, have you seen any churn going on by the employers as they figure out what these data scientists can do or not do?
Both, yes. So I guess with your first question, right, like how have we been seeing it kind of be defined? I think one of the interesting things about the field is that as we're dealing with all these different companies, everybody defines what they want out of that role in a completely different kind of capacity, right? And there's a million different ways that they might define that, or they might define their need for that. Like I think I heard somebody mention earlier about the ability to proactively monitor electric utilities for faults and failures. There's abilities to dive into data to try to figure out how can I find some process improvements to be able to improve the efficiency of this engine based on all this warranty data that you're getting back from it, right? But those skill sets that you might need out of both of them might be completely different. Maybe one of them requires, no visualization at all, and maybe another one requires that to be able to take something tangible to your engineers to say, hey, this is where all the failures are coming from. We need to be able to fix it. So what I see is that each industry is kind of helping to define some of those things, and best practices get defined over time, where now it sees like, okay, well that's what another company in our industry is doing, and then that will slowly kind of dictate what a data scientist will do in the financial world versus a data scientist in the product development world. Sorry, what was your second part?
Churn by employer.
Churn, yes. So like, I think sometimes what I've seen is sometimes people will hire data scientists without necessarily knowing exactly what to do with them. Or they'll want to invest in the field because they know it's important, or they think it's important, right? And so then you get that investment for that field, but then maybe that becomes the group that as projects slow down, you don't know what you're getting out of them anyway, so there's your churn. But I think in the groups and companies and corporations that have an actual like tangible plan about how to utilize that, you don't see that. I think it all has to do with like planning.
Say you've been a data scientist for a while and you know a lot of the core data science technologies, and you want to make yourself more attractive in the job market. What tangential or related skills should you pick up?
Okay, so Chris prepared me for this one. You knew this was coming, and I don't have a very clear answer. So what I would say about that is that what I see a lot of in terms of the data science roles from a tangible skill set side, a lot of Python and R. I see a lot of folks who are asking for data visualization type of tools so they can make some sense of that. Because again, like if you have to think about it, a lot of companies that might be hiring data scientists, this may be the first data scientist they've hired. It might be a new effort for their organization. And so in many cases, they don't really know what they're going to be getting out of it. They need that visualization to be able to show, okay, well, this is what it is, and this is what I can do with it. So I see some of those. And then outside of that, it really kind of depends on the company and how they're going to apply that to their product or their problem.
Like on that, do you see a lot of these positions are new time data scientist roles, or are most of these roles properly you're already part of the machine? Like if you were to join, if you were to take a random job out of the pool, you're more likely to be the first data scientist.
I would say the chances are much more likely in this profession than in other professions, for sure. Because again, like typically, I think it's an area that people want to be able to explore and want to be able to add to their organization to be able to find efficiencies and some of those kind of things. But again, like finding efficiencies is also somewhat a luxury in some cases, right? You can't always find efficiencies if you're not getting the job done, or if your profits are falling, or something along those lines. But I think when you have those organizations that have seen a positive outcome, or if you see some of those industries that have just been doing it for longer, and they know they have to have that as a part of their business, then it's more stable. And you're not the first cog in the machine, or so to use the analogy there.
If you don't mind, I'll allow you to add to this question.
Yeah.
Or answer this question. Communication skills. I'm teaching data scientists over at University of Maryland, and one of the things that we're finding when we ask, like, what do we need to be teaching, is, just as you mentioned, they're becoming more specialized, like if they're financial or engineering, is being able to speak to those communities of practice. So if you know the core data science skills, that's fantastic. Can you speak to financial analysts? Can you speak to journalists? Can you speak to engineers? Are you comfortable with reading technical reports for engineering? Are you comfortable knowing the difference if you need to know a tolerance model because you're working with medical practitioners, and what's acceptable for them is going to be very different than what's acceptable in, say, a financial sector. So being able to speak to those communities' practice in their own language, whether that's written, verbally, etc., that's, I think, the tangential skill you need.
As a business owner that does data scientist, I completely agree.
Yeah. And I will say this is kind of like an add-on to what you said. I think one interesting thing that I have seen with the data science world as well is I have seen more willingness in organizations and customers to be able to hire folks who are in the data science field that don't come from their industry, right? That just have that tangible skill set that they can apply to that. That is not true if you talk about most other technical skill sets. Like if you deal with a medical device company, they do not want to see an electrical engineer that didn't have a ton of FDA approved med device experience. But if you talk to them about a data scientist, they're much more willing to look at that. So that's one of the areas that I think it makes it kind of interesting and makes it, you know, that kind of profession that you can be able to utilize a bunch of different industries from the same kind of skill set.
On that note, one of the things that I've seen and heard a lot about is difficulty matching expectations in terms of job descriptions and role descriptions with actual expectations. A lot of companies are not good at that. At the same time, there's a willingness to bring data scientists on even if the skills don't perfectly match up, and even if they don't have a ton of experience in that specific industry. What are you seeing in terms of companies' expectations around ramp time and how long it takes a data scientist to get up to speed and start providing tangible value? Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I think that would probably also depend on how big the team is there that does some of that data science, right? If it's an unknown to them, where it is a newer team or something like that, they probably don't have a preset ramp time. But the one thing I'll say about job descriptions, right, is nobody likes writing job descriptions. It's actually like, if you ever tried to sit down and write a job description, it's actually kind of tough. It's kind of painful, right? And if you're trying to put that together, what you typically see is they use the same exact job description they used on the last 20 jobs, and it gets posted out there with maybe some minor edits. And so there are many times where that might not be as applicable to the problem they have that day, but that's what's easy and that's what's simple to put out there. So just know that when you're looking at things that, you know, it's not always exactly what it looks like.
So that kind of contradicts your point that we have to kind of pick and choose what we are trying to apply for. So if the job descriptions are the same everywhere, how is that picking and choosing it going to work?
I wondered if we were going to mention that. So, I think you should still be very, very particular, because you would know about what the company's background is. You would know the industry that organization is involved in. You would know what kind of projects they're involved in, and you would know if that kind of matches what you're looking for with that.
Go further behind the job description.
Correct. Yeah. So what I meant by that was that you should err more on the side of being particular with where you share that, and being intentional, because if you're intentional and you're strategic about how you go about applying to that job, and you do it more on a personal basis, where you're following up with calls and you're sending targeted cover letters and you're having more of that interpersonal communication, you'll see a significant amount more success than a scenario where it's applied to everything. So that can be a little bit difficult though.
Earlier you said there are firms that are sometimes trying to get that science team to for the buzz of it, because they're not sure yet what to do with that data science team. Do you have any idea of the proportion of companies, maybe locally or nationwide, that are more of that first camp or second camp?
I'm not sure if I've got a good stat for you on that. I just know in many of my interactions, especially with companies that are doing maybe their first hires into that area, or they're starting to engage more in that segment, that there are many times where they are also trying to figure it out, right? And so, you know, I think that, but I don't have a good stat on what proportion. So,
do you have a feel for, you know, so many job descriptions that want X years of experience? And everyone wants someone who's experienced, so even the so-called entry-level jobs, they already want you to have 2 years of experience. What's your sense for whether companies are really finding that, or if they're actually willing to take people who have less experience than what the rest?
Yeah, I mean, I think most places have some error, you know, there where they have some leeway in most of those things. Like, it's actually funny because that's usually one of our first conversations with somebody when we're having a discussion about qualifying a requirement, right? If they ask for, everybody wants 4 to 7 years of experience. I would say probably 50% of the people that call us with a requirement, 4 to 7 years of experience. But that does not describe 50% of the job population, right? And so a lot of times it's that flexibility around, hey, what are you willing to accept? And in most cases, people are willing to look at individuals who come from a slightly different background, as long as there's not some major issue as to why they would want somebody in that kind of gambit or that kind of area. Because we have had scenarios where we supported a team and maybe they have some preset labor categories from some particular program or project or something that they bid, in which they really do have to fill it in that area. But I mean, I think that the other area that's that also helps you with when you're doing that interpersonal communication side of things, right, is if you're sharing some of those kind of things and you're communicating more with a person, you can be able to discuss some of those types of areas. And okay, if this is a need here and it's close to where your experience level lies, can there be some flexibility with that? Yeah, Lachlan?
Yeah, so like interpersonal skills is very, very important. How do you put that on that initial application?
How do you put that you have interpersonal skills in the application? Or how do you put that out there?
You know, are you going to put it on your resume? Yeah, I'm really good at Python, I can do R, I can do MySQL, and also I'm good at talking to people.
No, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that it's as important that you digitally document your communication skills on the resume. I think it's more about again, like the way that you interact with folks when they're the ones who are hiring for the role. So that's what I meant by that. Like you know, we've had scenarios where folks will you know, will reach out to people on LinkedIn that they know might be individual hiring managers for that particular type of role, right? It's very old-fashioned, right? But people who write the thank you letters after interviews. People who send the cover letters and do that kind of that little piece there is definitely a differentiator.
Can I add to that real quick?
Yeah.
So I've actually supported some programs that are more on the technical side, some data science related, with on the government side. So primarily with FDA, HHS, and one of the big things with new hires is that they're trying, particularly around small businesses, they're trying to help that small position for an opportunity or multiple opportunities. So they're looking for that data scientist to help them make a compelling case to the client. So the communication skills, particularly around small business, is quite important. So an ability to sit down and have a conversation that doesn't go too far in the weeds, where you can have a discussion about an opportunity and help that company position is pretty important.
Actually, it's funny you mention that because I think that that's something I learned very early on in my career because like I mentioned, I think I mentioned earlier, I have a mechanical engineering degree, right? And so, you know, they don't teach you a lot of interpersonal skills with many of the degrees in engineering and science, right? But one thing you learn pretty quickly is that every career has some element of customer service and customer support and human interaction that exists within it, you know? And so like everything, like comp sci, you know, electrical engineers, everybody has some kind of a customer or something they're supporting or something they're giving updates on and the rest of those kind of things.
Yeah, I've definitely had a few experiences where clients on the government side will come back and say, we don't need to hear all that. We just need to know how you're going to support our business case to achieve our goals. So being able to recognize when the person you're sitting in front of is able to digest the more technical things or how you can translate that technical support that you're going to provide to the business objectives that are being made.
Okay, I think that's good.
On the hiring side of things, what value add do you see with these sort of gray experiences like online data science competitions like on Kaggle, Kaggle, depending on how you want to pronounce it, where it's not a job that you're getting hired for, but you're just trying to get stuff out there? And do you believe that there's a value add with putting that sort of experience into like an online portfolio?
I don't know. I mean, I think I would say I get varying levels of interest in the online portfolio or online resume side of things, just depending on what the customer is. But I absolutely think if it's something like if your target is to get into data science or to advance your career in that, and you have something that's experience related, that's data science, I would absolutely include it in your resume. And even if it is not something you're getting paid for, right? Like sometimes that's the stuff that people do in those transitionary stages if they're looking to advance their career into a different direction, you know. And so if that's what you have there and that's the experience that can help you to do that, I think it's always important to include it.
Link your GitHub is good. Basically.
Cool. And by the way, this is all my contact information. So, does anybody have any other questions? Okay.
So, when it comes to application process for data scientists or data analysts, does having more projects on your resume matters, or some kind of certification matters more?
What are you saying? If you had to compare the two?
Yeah,
projects
like-
versus certifications?
Yeah, like let's say there is one candidate competing with me
Mhm.
has a couple of projects on his resume for like using different tools, different libraries of Python,
Mhm.
or using R.
Well,
And
so
they
are you
have-
a student right now? Are you a student right now?
Yeah, I'm a student right now.
What year are you in?
I just completed first semester. I'm a graduate student at Towson.
Okay, got it. And have you had co-op and internships that you've already completed or worked in?
No, I'm actually applying to, but everywhere they are saying that come next year or so.
Yeah. So I mean, I would say like the number one thing you can do for yourself in the technical domain is to get co-op and internship experience, right? So that's obviously like your bar none, right? A lot of times if you're, what I've seen in the entry level skill sets across the board technical, right? If you have some of that experience going into it, it'll always give you a little bit of a leg up. The next step from there would be certifications and your coursework. And your certifications and your coursework, I haven't seen either one that necessarily would give you a leg up over the other. But as long as you're explaining and kind of targeting your certifications and coursework around what kind of role you're trying to go get. So if you're trying to go get a role in data science, as many of those things that can be applicable to the skill sets of data science, I'd include it. But I would also encourage you, if you have a little bit of time in between now and when you graduate, to really try to aggressively see if you can get some sort of co-op or internship experience, because it really is a huge leg up.
So, thank you so much for the presentation. As you know, like there are a lot of like small schools which gives like boot camps, like 8 weeks boot camps, 20 weeks boot camps, and like there are a lot of people who are graduating from those boot camps. How is the industry reaction on those people?
Right. Well, I mean, you saw the gap in the number of humans versus the number of jobs, right? And so, like, I think in those kind of scenarios, like if you do have experience from one of those boot camps, I think it's definitely viewed in a positive light. And again, like the gold standard is obviously, hey, some kind of experience, but any of the rest of those kind of certifications and training and education, that's coming in right beneath that in terms of how people are being engaged and judged. Did you have one last question? Or did you?
That was exactly what I was
Oh, okay, okay. Well, okay, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So again, like if you guys have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me at any time.